Hi, everybody. Nice job last week on the Christian denominations videos. I've very much enjoyed watching them. I've loved not only seeing and hearing your faces and voices again, but also the creativity with which some of you guys did it with, etc., etc. I've also gotten up with all of you now at this point in some way or fashion, so thanks for all for connecting with me or so. Okay, what I'm going to do now here today and this week is we're going to spend this week and at the end of the week, we'll have a kind of online or written Socratic seminar. It'll be your choice. And if you look online, you can see how that's done. But we're going to spend this week looking at Christianity in the United States of America. This would have really been the focus of our second unit on Christianity, kind of like we did like Buddhism in Japan when we did Buddhism. We would have done Christianity in the United States and really looked at that because the United States is one of the most diverse Christian nations going, and also we all live here and we've got experience in it and stuff like that. And it usually leads to some really interesting discussions. I'm going to try to recreate the best of those as I can online, and the most interesting ones, but it's not going to be as perfect as it was, which is really kind of a bummer because this is generally a kind of fun end of the year unit or so. Okay. So, with that said, let's go ahead and start because in order to be able to talk about Christianity in the United States, you need to know something about the history of Christianity in the United States, and that's what this is going to do, is basically take you kind of through that. This first side gives you an idea of exactly what I was saying when I said it's at least one of the more diverse, or was founded as one of the more diverse. Not that there's a whole lot of diversity just in Protestant and Catholic as far as Christianity goes. You know, it's what the New World in the United States and Canada were, at least the English-speaking part of the New World. To be honest, this should also really include Eastern Orthodox. There's plenty of that in the United States as well. And so basically, what we're really looking at is not the Coptic Christians living among Muslims thing that they have in Africa, which is really kind of a uniquely Egyptian thing or stuff like that. But for the United States, for the most part, the United States is an incredibly diverse religious community, particularly in Christianity. And we'll look at a couple charts on that as we go along further on. I kind of splice that with the history. Um, so, in case you'd forgotten this, just to give you a really, 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 really quick overview of this, the United States was founded because of religious issues. I actually enjoy the irony in this because it's kind of the opposite of what's going on today. But ironically, the north of the United States was founded for religious reasons, and the South was founded for economic reasons. And those kind of flipped as far as their focus a little bit later, or kind of in modern United States or so. But this whole thing starts because you've got the break in England, and you've got Anglicanism, and England is no longer part of the Catholic Church, right? And some people in England who uh, saw Henry break with the Catholic Church thought, okay, he didn't go far enough. And those people become kind of hardcore Anglicans, and then eventually they buy into other things like original sin and predestination. And these guys become known as Puritans, okay? We know them as pilgrims because they are really, really, really annoying. They think that religion should focus on like 100% that you can create like heaven on earth. You should focus religion and their version of hardcore Christianity on life the whole time. And that's all you should worry about. That means no singing, no dancing, no gambling, no drinking, no bear baiting and cockfighting, which was a big deal back in that time, stuff like that. And so, to be honest, they really kind of sucked as far as like people enjoying life and like being able to have them around. Oliver Cromwell, if you remember anything about the English Civil War, was Puritans. And after about 11 years of that, the English were like, can we have our king back, please? So anyway, eventually, around 1620, somebody said, hey, you know what, guys, how about you get on a boat and you go? Um, and you know what? We'll even pay for that boat. You know what? We'll pay for a boat. We got your boat right here. Just go. Okay. And these are our pilgrims, and this is Plymouth Rock, and this is 1620. Now remember, the United States had been settled before that, or what would be the United States in 1607 by the English, and even the 1500s by the Spanish in Florida. But this was the first kind of religious settlement, if that makes sense. And they went over here and they tried to set up a new heaven on Earth. They tried to set up a city on a hill. This is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, if you remember U.S. history. Sinners are the hands of an angry God. Stuff along those lines. Things are based in and around reading of scripture, etc., etc. And a lot of your northern states are founded for that. Like Pennsylvania becomes kind of a Quaker haven, if that makes sense. Maryland was founded as a safe haven for Catholics, etc., etc. Okay. And that's kind of the beginning part of like U.S. religion. But it's important to note that from the beginning of the United States, religion has been actively involved in American life and American politics its entire time. Fast forward about 150 years or so, we've gone into, past the ages of the Enlightenment. If you think about it from like 1620 to 1750, and you go to European history, right, a lot happens, and you've got like absolute monarchs all the way to the Enlightenment, right? And we go all the way to the age of the Enlightenment and stuff like that. And much of the world's educated has stopped believing like that the Bible is literal. Okay, my favorite example of this, which is mentioned down below, is something called the Jefferson Bible. Because Thomas Jefferson, if you can imagine this, and you can find it, it's in the Smithsonian. You can buy one online if you're interested. It's actually kind of fascinating. Took two copies of the Bible, and he sat there and he clipped out what he thought you could prove via logic, and he got rid of everything else that you couldn't prove via logic, and then he put the Gospels back together that way, right? And this is like the epitome. So like, things like raising people of the dead, no, that's out. Things like, saying like blessed are the poor for they should inherit the earth. Yeah, absolutely. That's in stuff along those lines, right? And this is what is a perfect example of what like Europe's educated elite, granted that he's American, but either way, you understand my point, had gotten to at this point. And every single state around this time had very different rules, and they've got to decide, they're going to become like one country, et cetera, okay? And the three most populous states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, all of those have like massive students of the Enlightenment. I mean, I just mentioned Jefferson for Virginia, you got Franklin and people like that in Pennsylvania, you got Sam Adams and Thomas Paine in Massachusetts, stuff along those lines. And these guys have mainly gone to this idea of deism. Now, deism is this idea that, in case you've forgotten, that like God created the world, but he no longer interferes in it. So it still buys into Christianity and stuff like that. And it says God the watchmaker is no longer present. And by that, means that like he created the world, but like the watchmaker doesn't follow his watch around the whole time. He gets the watch started and lets it go, and then it goes off and running. And that was the comparison here. Were they actually Christian as far as believing in Jesus being the Messiah? That's debatable. Franklin said he wasn't sure about that, but he'd find out soon enough right before he died. But they still bought into the Christian ideas and stuff like that, and they would have considered themselves Christian, just a very, very, very liberal compared to the rest of like Europe at that time version of Christianity, if that makes sense. And since those guys are mainly in advance, what they push for very hard in the United States, having seen the history of religious war and religious conflict in Europe, and know that they had a chance to actually change this, is they push for freedom of religion. Okay, the Virginia Statutes of Religious Freedom become the model for this. And it becomes one of the most famous and first examples of religious freedom that lasts all the way to the modern day. And here it is right here. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of press, or the speech of the press, the right of people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances, blah, blah, blah. We care about the highlighted part. The other part's very, very lovely. I love it. I think it's fantastic. It's one of the greatest documents ever written, but we care for this class about the highlighted part. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We're going to talk about that. What happens when those two conflict? What happens when someone says, but wait, you've told me that I have to bake a cake for somebody who's gay, but my religion says I can't do that. So you're telling me that you're prohibiting the free exercise of my religion, or you're making established. I mean, this is something, and I'm giving you a modern example that comes up in today's society all the time. This is something that the Supreme Court has been sorting out and litigating since this thing was written, basically, more or less. And that's the situation that is the official law of the land as far as the United States goes. The question that's interesting that comes into this that we're not going to look at is America stayed a very, very Christian nation and also involved religion in its politics quite a lot, to both good and bad things. As we say this, we should note that religion has led to some of the best things, okay, in socio-cultural history and stuff like that. Most of your charities and things like that are all set up by religions. As far as pushing forward ideas of women's rights and stuff like that, a lot of that came into early religion and stuff along those lines. Trying to get rid of alcoholism, not necessarily prohibition, but abuse and stuff like that. All of that was based in our early religion. So religion and politics has done some really good things and also some really bad things, and it's important to keep that in mind. Right here, and I appreciate that this is about 10 years old at this point. Right here is a breakdown of major religious traditions in the United States. And you'll notice that according to this, about 78% of people identify as Christian. And of those Christians, about half of those identify as Protestant, right? And about 25% is Catholic, and the other 25% making up various things from Greek Orthodox to like blah, et cetera, et cetera. You also then have, and you can see the rest of the United States is fairly uh, either kind of like other religions are fairly small. You've got Judaism and Buddhism and Islam, like all at like a couple percentage points. Islam is probably higher, probably like 3 or 4 percentage points now. And then you also notice that like you've got atheist, agnostic, et cetera, don't know, don't care. So it's kind of an interesting breakdown for a country that like, says, hey, like everybody's welcome, everybody come here, blah, 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 et cetera, to then see it just kind of like this. Set in here is just an interesting commentary. I don't know what it means one way or the other. I just think it's kind of interesting. So after the United States gets that clause in there and gets its independence, kind of going back to the history now that you've seen the kind of religious breakdown in the U.S. today. We have in the early 1800s something known as the Second Great Awakening. The United States is still Christian. It's way more Protestant than it is Catholic. Despite the lack of state religion, it's still a very, very big deal. If you see, this is the thing to keep in mind is while the founding fathers said, we're not going to have an official state religion, that didn't mean that the people who were like, just chilling right there, all of a sudden gave up their religion in any way. As a matter of fact, a number of them actually disagreed with that and said, we should have had a religion, blah, 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 blah. That's another story for later and not for this class, unfortunately. And so a series of religious revivals begin in the Midwest. And what that means is that exactly what you'd kind of think of if you think of almost like a 1930s revival during the Great Depression too, but setting up these very large tents, people going from town to town, and trying to get a number of people to convert and like repent kind of en masse, okay? Church membership soars at this time, and actually it dovetails perfectly with like the idea of manifest destiny, because this is the time that people are saying like, okay, we're going to grab this area, blah, 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 and as every town moves over, the church goes there, or various churches go there, and like they go and compete almost in a capitalist way for like people going on. And this is going to be true all through the 19th century. Even after the Civil War, once we get into Go West, my friend, okay, we're moving into Oklahoma. Cool, the Baptists, the Methodists, everybody's going to send a preacher out there to try to get people together, et cetera, et cetera. Aside from kind of bringing back up any like kind of part of the of like religion that like the Revolutionary War and the early founding had killed or something like that. This also leads to a number of uniquely American religions. The largest one to be successful at this point, Methodist, is not uniquely American. And if you're, by the way, still really interested in looking into the textbook and stuff like that, I've got a short writing on Methodism from the Wesley brothers. I've got something for you to think about, like the direct evidence for their role of Christianity and stuff like that. But Methodism, which is an offshoot of Anglicanism, just surges in the U.S. South, and people convert on droves. White people, but also slaves, will convert, and eventually found something called the American Methodist Episcopalian Church, right? This is in the same time in upstate New York that Joseph Smith has his vision that we'll talk about. That leads to the founding of Mormonism. This is the same time that the Baptists also take root, et cetera, et cetera. And it really is a fairly vibrant time for kind of American religion. The first church I want to talk about as an example of uniquely American religion here is the AME, or the American Methodist Episcopalian Church. And it's the historically black church, or the most famous historically black church in the United States. I didn't give it as like a different denomination because it's technically in communion with the Methodist Church. But it's called American Methodist Episcopalian because its system uses a governing system of the Episcopalian Church, so it's technically the same denomination as the Methodist Church, and I didn't want to necessarily have it have people misunderstand like its use and stuff like that. So I figured I'd talk about it now. So as I said, it stands for African because it was founded by Africans, former Africans. Methodist is the denomination it used, and its hierarchy is Episcopalian, and it was mainly founded on the idea um, that maybe the at the time the Methodist churches reading of pro-slavery, pro-white, pro-racist ideas, maybe those weren't accurate, and maybe we should look at it from a non-white point of view. And that's why I said there's emphasis on Africa's impact on religion, as well as deconstructing like white imperialist notions of religion and Christianity and stuff like that. Um, the other reason for its founding too was because it was founded by slaves in a place where, like, people were either slaves either weren't allowed to have a official organized religion, or if they did, they had the religion of their masters. This was also somewhat banned at the time because people saw it as slaves congregating, and then they were afraid that, like, that could lead to rebellion and stuff, which only made it like further and made it bigger and stuff like that. And as like a kind of quiet thing in the South, while it also grew in the North and the Midwest and stuff like that. But in the era of Reconstruction, this becomes a really, really important symbol in the U.S. South for the quote-unquote new black community. It grows exponentially in size by then. And the AME and the Southern Baptist thing that grew out of it, because like the Southern Baptist church that split out of it also has roots in this. That's precisely where the main leaders of the civil rights movement, from Martin Luther King, the Southern Baptists and stuff like that, in a Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where those guys are going to come out of religiously. And most of those guys did have like some type of like grounding in religion or something like that. It's now one of the most popular religions among Black Americans in the United States, and you can actually see that, like, it's still, I guess, somewhat controversial or stuff in the U.S. It's not somewhat controversial. This is a radical or something like that. But this is exactly what Dylann Roof attacked in Charleston in 2015 when he went to a generally black prayer breakfast. So I guess the way to say it is it's seen by, like, these ridiculous radicals as still a symbol of, like, black and, like, of black, I guess, not power for lack of a better word, but black people having a community and being able to control and do stuff like that. And so it's seen as a negative by racists, obviously, like Dylann Roof. But for everybody else, it's kind of the like official, or not official, but the original beacon of religion for the black community in the United States. The other one that I'd like to talk about at this time is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And given the population that we have, which has a fairly big Mormon population in this area, we're going to spend all of tomorrow looking at this. Okay, so I've got like some things for you to check out online and read and stuff like that, so you can get an idea. But to make a long story short, it involves this dude by the name of Joseph Smith. And the story goes that he had a vision that told him that the Second Great Awakening is going on, and he's got all these churches going around, and they're coming around, and he's got advertisements almost like for Methodist, blah blah blah, and like Baptist here and blah blah blah. And he's like, what religion should I be? And so a vision told him none, that he should go into the woods and he should find a series of gold plates that would tell him the next divine revelation of Christianity, right? And so the belief is that, like, the Book of Mormon and Mormonism doesn't deal with like all the problems of the Catholic Church. Mormons like fully admit that, like, the New Testament's been changed, the Old Testament's been changed. The church has a bunch of like rituals and stuff like that aren't officially in there, and stuff along those lines. And so this is like the uncorrupted like revelation at this point, the last revelation of God, known as the Book of Mormon at this time, and it's published in 1830. Joseph Smith gets a decent amount of followers. Originally in upstate New York. Mormons are highly, highly, highly persecuted at this time. There are a number of reasons that are sociocultural BS, racism, and bullshit and stuff along those lines. From a religious point of view, the main reason given for it from a religious point of view is that Mormons are blasphemous because they don't believe in the Trinity. Now, I don't know why that translates to therefore they should die and be persecuted and stuff like that. That's another thing for religious zealots that doesn't make sense to me. But the idea is that since Mormon, one of the things in one of Joseph Smith's multiple visions, he saw the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit as three separate things, and so Mormons believe that all three exist, but the Trinity's that they're three separate, distinct things, and that teaching right there got them a lot of old school crap, and they ended up moving around from Illinois into Missouri. We talked about the Mormon kill order in Missouri at one time, and lots of kind of random violence and stuff like that going through. Joseph Smith is killed in a riot in Carthage. in Carthage, Illinois, and Brigham Young is the guy that takes over his kind of church or so at that point. And Brigham Young then takes his followers and they actually move to a place that's not in the United States at that point, which is Salt Lake City, Utah. They're trying to find a place to practice their religion in peace, and eventually it ends up becoming the epicenter of the LDS and stuff along those lines. And we will talk about that more tomorrow. I've always found this map somewhat fascinating. This is percentage of people attending a religious service on a weekly basis in modern United States. Um, And it's done by state, and you can see we live in a very unreligious part of the country, and that the vast majority of the hardcore religious part of the country, this is what I was getting at the kind of reverse in the founding, occurs in the South, and then of course over in Utah, which is that one red state there. If you're not aware of this, you live in what is statistically either the least or second least religious city in the United States, the other being San Francisco. Um, and that is depending on how you slice it or how you look at it or stuff like that. But less people identify as being part of a religious movement or church or attending it on a regular basis than any other city in the country. Okay. Second part of the 19th century to understand like how we got into American politics and stuff like that. And I am going to go through this slide at like lightning speed here because most of it you guys already know. Um, is really just kind of talk about the beginning or the divide that occurs in kind of the north east involving like Protestants and Catholics or so. Because what's happened is most of the people that came to the United States early on, with the exception of in Maryland, were Protestant, right? And most of the people that are coming in the 1800s are Catholic, okay? And these tend to be particularly in places like Boston and New York, like Irish and Italian immigrants, stuff along those lines. People are coming to a country not to looking to found it, but looking for a better life or stuff along those lines. And so this leads actually in the United States to a number of basically discrimination or religious racism, for lack of a better word, um, towards Catholics and towards people that are not traditionally mainstream Protestant. So like if you don't fall into that category of like Lutheran, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, or Baptist, like, there traditionally has been some type of like, or some type of discrimination against you in the United States. This, for example, is why Kennedy had to give a whole speech when he was running for president. We've only had one Catholic president ever, about how, he wouldn't be subservient to the Pope or stuff like that. And that, along with kind of the social Darwinism and the quote-unquote Protestant work ethic of the early, like, 19th century, early 20th century is really where like the United States kind of finds itself sitting here with religion and going into like the 20th century or so. The last thing I want to talk about in this kind of overview here is religion and American politics. Because depending on your point of view, as I said earlier, this has kind of been going on from the beginning. Yet at the same time, like you've got such a massive contradictions. In the Treaty of Tripoli, which the United States government signed in 1797, it specifically said the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Yet when he was running for president in 1800, one of the accusations leveled against him as being a bad person was that Thomas Jefferson was an atheist. So as I said, this has always kind of been like mildly involved in this. There have been sectional divides involving this where like, people have said, okay, but I'm only going to vote for a Catholic. I'm only going to vote for a Catholic running for like, the House of Representatives or stuff along those lines. As well as like divides like as well as divides based in and around like party politics. So for example, like, it could be sectional, but it could also be like, the Democrats like in the South are pretty much only going to nominate Protestants. White Protestant is pretty much a requirement, being a WASP for running for the Democratic Party after after the Civil War. And what this does, though, lead to, and what's worth kind of bringing up in here, is this idea of kind of legislating morality or so. Because that is one key thing that comes in American politics with this. And this is where American politics is kind of differed from other things like that. Because, you know, you get a place like Britain, which fully says, hey, we're a Christian country, blah, blah, blah. You have to take Christianity in schools. You do, it's compulsory. You have things like that, and then there are prayers at the beginning of Parliament and stuff like that, and so various like rules and things are based in and around Christianity. America claims to not have any of that, yet bases various things in and around that. For example, like, you know, even prohibition started by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, right? As an example of legislating morality. One of the most famous examples of this and famous cases of this is in the Scopes monkey trial, which wasn't even a legislative thing, but more just literally a, like, you know, well, it was you can't teach evolution in schools, but then, like, you know, the fallout and the result with that, and how people thought of it, and the fact that, like, you know, you had like this guy that was a huge like liberal socialist at the time, William Jennings Bryant, like defending, like, you know, the Christianity part of it at the time. So, like, I mean, it definitely has made its way into American politics, which brings us to our last question at this point, and what we're going to kind of look at for the rest of this week, which is America a Christian nation? And actually, in classic IB fashion, I've always framed this as, is America a Christian nation? And I always have at least one kid that raises his hand and is like, Dorn, I think a better way to put it would be, to what extent is America a Christian nation? And I'm like, thanks a lot for that. Either way, you know, right after World War II, getting into the 50s and 60s, it seemed like a lot of people felt like they were just kind of going through the motions, that, like, it was mechanical. It was common to go to Sabbath on in the 50s, but, like, it wasn't, like, you know, a hardcore, like, thing that people bought into, and actually they started losing a lot of people in Christianity. New movements in arts and sciences had things fall off even more, and came this idea of kind of secular Christianity. You know, Christians looked around and saw all the Jews that they knew being like, I'm Jewish, but I don't go to church or to temple, and I don't, you know, actually practice or do anything, so why don't I do the same thing? And so people came that. This is where, you know, when people sometimes ask me my religion, I'll be like, well, I was raised Methodist or something along those lines, is kind of the best way to put it, even though I don't really have a religion today. I don't really follow religion. But we should note that in the 1980s, and this is what we'll look at on Wednesday, in the late 1970s, but in the 80s and 90s, religion comes back into American politics pretty hardcore with the neoconservative movement and the moral majority. The family values movement of the 1990s brings people like Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham. Well, Billy Graham was earlier, sorry. He was in the 60s and 70s, but brings people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson to the forefront. And you get to the point that you've got people like, you know, believing or bringing in, and this is a teeny minority, religion into the politics, into religion all the time. I mean, I was watching John Oliver make fun of somebody the other day for saying that if you question Donald Trump, you were questioning God, because only God would want him on place. And again, it's like, you know, 15 people in a small place in Oklahoma saying this, but, like, it still gives you the idea that, like, you know, despite what we've said over and over again, you know, is America a Christian nation? Is religion American politics, et cetera, et cetera? I don't have a great answer to any of this. It's just a question I like to ask a lot because I'd like to see what people say. This thing I found right here in the New York Times is one of my all-time favorite charts that I qualify as, here's an interesting chart that I'm not surely exactly what it means, but here's an interesting chart. And what it is on the top, the x-axis is percent of college graduates by religion, and the y-axis is percent of households earning an annual income above 75K. Okay, like, so for example, Reform Jews are most likely to graduate from, or most likely to earn an annual income above 75K, whereas Hindus are more likely to graduate from college, however. And it kind of takes you on through. The national average is right down here. You get, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses and Pentecostals on the end, kind of down here. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians in the middle. Anglicans, Unitarians. It's just an interesting kind of cross section of how religion does impact, like, public life in some way. And, like, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses are told not to involve themselves in politics because, you know, it would take away from God and stuff like that. And so that explains, like, why they would be, you know, or in education or something like that. And that explains why they would be further down on the bottom. So I've just always found this chart interesting. I like to bring this up as we look at a number of different things that give you an idea of how religion affects American life. I'll leave you with this. I'll leave you with this right here. As I said earlier, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that's known as the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which is known as the Free Exercise Clause. Which one wins, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause? And while we're at it, can the government legislate morality? Whose morality are they choosing? Are they choosing Christianity's morality? Are they choosing Islam's morality? Are they choosing Judaism's morality, Buddhism's morality? Can they do it even if not in the name of Christianity? If so, who says that's right? And what comes along those lines? How does religion become the guiding and governing thing of politics and principles here? These are all things we're going to kind of think about. I wish we had like the 3 to 4 weeks like we normally do to talk about this thing and go into it hardcore. But we'll do it over the course of the next week, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it, and hopefully I'll see you all on some type of Zoom call or something like that on Friday.